Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Israel carried out limited strikes in Iran in retaliation for Tehran's massive drone and missile attack on Israel. Earlier, Israel was able to neutralize nearly all of 300 Iranian drones and missiles with its air defense system, along with help from the U.S. and Arab partners. Today, we look at what lessons Korea can learn from the Iran-Israel conflict. We also discuss the U.S. defense commitment to South Korea.
When it comes to threats posed by the DPRK in Iran, something that we take very seriously.
북한의 도발 가능성에 대해서도 확고한 대비 태세를 유지해 주기 바랍니다.
We're working with the ROK and Japan in a trilateral fashion.
In the studio with me, Mr. Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a Washington-based policy initiative. Mr. Colby served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. He is the author of The Strategy of Denial. Also joining us, Mr. Robert Peters, the Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Peters served as the lead strategist at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He was also the Special Advisor for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Now, Mr. Peters, Israel's attack on Iran was the latest escalation between the two countries. And soon after Iran's direct attack on Israel, the U.S. government said that it is incredibly concerned about the cooperation between North Korea and Iran. And South Korean government said that it is closely monitoring whether there is any North Korean technology used in Iranian missiles. Given the past history, do you think there are traces of North Korean technology in the Iranian missiles that were targeting Israel at this time?
Yeah, it's a great question. The North Korean and Iranian cooperation on military technology goes back to the 1980s when North Korea was a supplier to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. Many of the missiles that Iran fields today and many of the missiles that they used over the weekend are based upon North Korean designs. The Musadong, the Nodong, others have all transferred into the Iranian missile program. The Shahab-3 is in many ways a North Korean ballistic missile clone. And so I think that the collaboration is longstanding, and I think from what we've seen, it continues to this day.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Peters, when Iran attacked Israel intercepted 99% of the 300 drones and missiles. What is the key takeaway for South Korea? And also that high success rate was not only because of its own Iron Dome, but also because of the help from the United States and Arab partners. Do you think U.S. and Japan and South Korea, therefore, should integrate their missile defense system?
So I think, as you pointed out, the missile defense over Israel over the weekend is a good news story for Israel, certainly. I think it shows the efficacy of missile defenses when done correctly. I will say that Israel had a lot of strategic warning. As you pointed out, they had assistance from the United States as well as some Arab partners who were doing some of the queuing. And so I think the takeaway for South Korea is that missile defenses are a good thing for a relatively compact nation like South Korea. They've got a small number of urban areas that if they put in effective missile defenses, such as THAAD, such as Patriot batteries, that can go far to mitigating some of the missile threat from North Korea. And that's something that should be pursued. I think the closer collaboration between the United States, Japan, and South Korea on a missile defense perspective is a good thing. And as I said earlier on this program, I support further integration as time moves forward, because I think that becomes mutually beneficial to all parties.
I want to transition into U.S. commitment to South Korea. Secretary Austin said in a recent House hearing that the FY 2025 budget request will ensure that U.S. forces in and around the Korean Peninsula remain ready to respond to aggression by the DPRK. Now, Mr. Colby, in a contingency situation, U.S. would be focused on reacting to China. Now, will the U.S. be able to keep its defense commitment to South Korea? Will the U.S. provide a nuclear umbrella to South Korea when North Korea can strike U.S. mainland?
Well, look, the Biden administration is very good at making promises. I think they're not very good at backing it up. So, Secretary Austin and President Biden can say a lot of things, but their own defense budget, which is not a two-war force by any stretch. In fact, we're not sure we'd be able to deal with China, grows defense spending by lower than the rate of inflation. And of course, we're having historic readiness challenges. 40% of our attack submarines are in the yard. We're exhausting large numbers of our missile defenses, critical missile defenses in places like Ukraine and the Middle East. So we're not where we need to be, and it's the Biden administration's own assessment in their defense strategy that we do not have a force that's equipped to fight multiple conflicts. And as we've discussed in the past, we have to be focused on China. Does that mean we abandon South Korea? Absolutely not. I think South Korea is a critical ally, and our alliance is vital, but we need to have a more realistic understanding between ourselves about what the United States is going to be in a position to provide. It's the same thing I tell the Europeans and that I said to the Israelis as well in the press, that China has to be our priority. So yes, I think there are things that the United States can and should do to aid South Korea's defense against North Korea, including missile defenses, including a nuclear umbrella, and the same goes for NATO. The problem that we've discussed is that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, as they're accelerating, are posing a more and more significant threat to overwhelm our missile defenses and our ability. And I don't think large-scale preemption is a very realistic option, and I'm not sure. I don't think it would really work very well anyway. So I think this presents a problem that we need to talk together about and grapple with the reality rather than ignore it.
North Korea, when it has that capability to strike any one of the American cities, then will the U.S. provide nuclear umbrella to South Korea?
I think, I think we can have a nuclear umbrella. For instance, I think there are other nuclear capabilities that we could consider employing, but obviously the United States does not want to get into the business of city trading with North Korea. And this is a fact that we recognized during the Cold War, which is why we developed significant conventional forces in Europe, theater nuclear forces. The British and the French had nuclear forces in Europe. There were, nuclear forces, U.S. nuclear forces were deployed in various places elsewhere in the world. So I think this is something that we should, nobody can know. Here's the way I'll put it. South Korea's security should not depend on trusting the United States to sacrifice 5 American cities to do something to North Korea. That we do not want to go there because that is obviously a place the American people are not going to want to go. And South Korea shouldn't be an open step on the escalatory ladder for North Korea to say, well, I can go here and I know I've checkmated them.
I think he's right. I mean, Secretary Austin talked about how we have the rock-solid guarantee to South Korea and that the president's NDAA, the defense budget, makes that happen. So a few things about the NDAA. It only has funding to build 12 more SM-3 missiles, which are the interceptors that worked so well over the weekend in Israel. Only 12. Guys like Bridge, myself, others have been advocating for a significantly increased missile magazine of cruise missiles, TLAMs, missile defenses, anti-ship capabilities. The president's budget, it has no increase for any missile purchases other than 12 missiles, I think, of LRASMs. Other than that, it's the exact same as the previous year for building more missiles. So this is not, I would submit, an administration that is taken with the issue that we could be at war with a peer competitor and we are building the forces and giving them the munitions that they need to deter the conflict from beginning in the first place. I am concerned about us, the United States, being overstretched between the support that we're providing to Ukraine, the support that we're providing to Israel, and the need to deter a major war in East Asia simultaneously.
So Mr. Colby touched upon many areas, but he also noted that in essence that United States will not give up 5 American cities to defend South Korea. Do you agree with that?
So this was a question that our NATO allies grappled with in the Cold War. And so Bridge said that we put out thousands of tactical nuclear warheads in Europe during the Cold War, on top of the 500,000 Americans that were on the front lines. And frankly, I think the number was like 2.7 million NATO allies had men under arms and tens of thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of fighter aircraft. And all that goes into a credible deterrence posture. You need a really strong conventional military capability, and we invested in, we had about 6,000 at the height of tactical theater nuclear weapons in Europe, so that if things went nuclear in Europe, commanders on the ground could use those weapons to try to keep a nuclear exchange localized within the theater so that we would not be put into that position in which we're trading New York or Washington or Chicago for Paris or Bonn or Berlin. And this was the question our allies had 50 years ago. Is this credible? Are you really going to trade New York for Paris? It was a famous question. And we could never fully assure them that we were willing to do so. And some Americans said, well, I'm not sure we would have done that.
In fact, President Reagan admitted later, and I believe Robert McNamara also, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think Bob's putting it very well. And what I said was a little bit, just to kind of specify, because the essence of what you're saying is correct. But my point has been that if you ask Americans, North Korea is attacking South Korea or threatening to do something with South Korea, in order to substantiate XYZ, we're going to lose 5 American cities. I think common sense indicates that's going to be a very, very, very hard sell in a country that's a democracy. How are the people who are in those 5 cities going to react to that policy proposal, or their family members or their neighbors, right? I think what we did in the Cold War was we confronted this question. Charles de Gaulle, for instance, asked it very directly and bluntly. And we, as Bob was very eloquently putting it, we developed a strategy that didn't rely on that. But instead, what it was going to force the Soviet Union to do was to have to fight a much larger war that escalated to a level where you could imagine, because nobody can give that guarantee that we would do it. But that's the important thing, is not to allow North Korea to have a way of employing nuclear weapons that presents it as, well, North Korea is doing this, and you're going to lose 5 American cities. Now, if it's a war of North Korea with China, and I go into this at length in my book, if it's a much wider war, this is why the important thing is to force China, North Korea, et cetera, to have to fight a much larger war if they're going to present us with that choice. Now, the whole point is to avoid a war. Let me stress that point. But the idea is not to give them a route to say, well, I've checkmated you. All I'm saying is I want a political condominium with South Korea that is going to be under the supervision of Pyongyang, and if you disagree, I'm going to nuke 5 American cities, if realistically, if you're thinking about what missile defenses can do. And of course, I think a President of the United States, if he's presented with the option of saying, well, the North Koreans seem to be doing something unusual, this is our chance to try to attack the North Korean leadership and North Korean nuclear forces, but we're going to have to start World War III. And then we're definitely going to get 5 to 10 nuclear weapons. That's what we don't want to do. So we need to have clarity between ourselves and our own thinking so that we come up with a strategy and a force posture along the lines of what Bob was saying that actually mitigates this threat from North Korea.
And just to pull this thread a little bit more on this. So from about 1962 on, the American strategy in Europe was very conventional, very credible conventional capabilities and these thousands of nuclear weapons, so that if the Warsaw Pact initiated conflicts, there were so many capabilities arrayed against them, it was almost inescapable that somehow both sides would get caught into this escalatory spiral that neither side really knew how to get out of, and that would end in cataclysm for both sides. Therefore, don't start the war.
Exactly. Which led to peace. That's
which led to
point.
peace.
Exactly.
Right. And but the key is we had to field the capabilities to make them believe that. And the problem is today is that the United States doesn't have the conventional capabilities in the West Pac to do that, nor do we have the theater nuclear capabilities in the Western Pacific, because frankly, we got rid of all of those at the end of the Cold War, which is why I personally advocate for things like the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, the new Air-Launched Cruise Missile, a more diverse theater nuclear capability to give the adversary pause.
Mr. Peters, I want to present you a more specific scenario. The Biden administration says that any use of nuclear weapons would be the end of the North Korean regime. However, former senior North Korean officials who have defected disagree with that, saying that Kim Jong-un only stays in Pyongyang just a few months of the year, and when it's an emergency situation, he would stay in mansions near the border with Russia and China, in mansions like Changseong Chodeso or Baekdusan Samjian Chodeso. They ask that will the U.S. be willing to strike Kim Jong-un near the border with Russia or China, will the U.S. be ready to go in a conflict with these two countries?
So again, as Bert said earlier, at the end of the day, only the president is going to be the person to make that decision as whether or not the United States is going to employ nuclear weapons. And so we can speculate, but at the end of the day, that's up to his or her mind. Doing targeted assassinations with nuclear weapons is, I would imagine, significantly hard for a lot of the reasons that you just pointed out. It's not to diminish either the secondary impacts of using large number of nuclear weapons. You can define what large is, but let's just say probably more than 20. You're going to have a downwind range hazard that's going to go over Japan, which we don't want to do. It's probably, as you pointed out, going to have cross-border effects into China, depending on what targets we're striking and the yield of the weapon and so forth. That said, a president is going to be confronted with, Mr. President, it's going to take these number of weapons, and his eyes are going to get as big as Frisbees, to kill Mr. Kim and to end this regime forever. And here's all the secondary, tertiary impacts of that, and we don't know what the North Korean response is. We may not get all the North Korean weapons. And he's not going to like that, but he's also not going to like leaving the Kim regime in place after they use nuclear weapons. It's going to be a really hard choice for him to make.
I mean, it's very hard to see actually following through on that because a couple things. One thing, the Soviets, towards the end of the Soviet Union, had something called the dead hand, apparently, which was basically an automatic system that if the Soviet leadership was taken out, that would automatically launch all of their nuclear weapons. Now, Kim Jong-un seems like a nastier guy than even Yuri Andropov. So I imagine, and they worry about our military superiority. So I think we have to assume that they have something like that, and that taking out Kim Jong-un, and by the way, taking out Kim Jong-un does not mean we get Mikhail Gorbachev or whoever. We might get somebody worse or who just follows the same path. So I don't think taking out the leadership, we have to take out all their nuclear weapons, and among other things, chemical weapons probably as well, biological weapons I'm sure they have. I don't know, but the other thing about North Korea is it's got massive amounts of tunnels, and it's hard to hit mobile targets, so I don't think we can assume that. And of course, if we've launched a massive strike to decapitate the leadership, we have to assume they're going to attack the United States, essentially without any constraint. Whereas if they use a nuclear weapon in some other way, then this again, in the Cold War, we always were thinking about limited nuclear options and the possibility of escalation management. Now, ultimately, fortunately, we all decided it was not a risk we wanted to take.
And just to finish the thought, we never targeted like the Kremlin for nuclear assassination during the Cold War. Like that was never, at least in any war point I ever saw. So to end the North Korean regime, it's not simply killing, Kim Jong-un or killing him and his sister or whatever. It actually, if you're getting down to it for all the reasons that Bridge laid out, for the tunnels and the dispersion and so forth, to make sure nothing else gets through, what you're actually talking about is irradiating all of North Korea. Like, let's be very honest. The only way to do this properly is to lay down enough warheads to utterly destroy North Korea. And then again, I think you're going to go to the president and say, Mr. President, here's the plan. Do you want to do this? That's what I said. His eyes are going to get as big as Frisbees. He's going to say, I don't know, guys.
We're in a world of bad choices, and anybody who's telling you that they have an easy way out is not being honest with you.
Before we go, Mr. Peters, because of the uncertainties surrounding North Korea's nuclear use that we just talked about, South Koreans want to get their own nuclear weapons. And some people even say that both South Korea and North Korea having nuclear deterrent goes for higher chance of peaceful coexistence. And they point to India and Pakistan's case. What is your take?
I would take issue with anyone who describes the India-Pakistan relationship as peaceful coexistence. But what I would say is the United States is not and hasn't been for about half a century pro-proliferation. Before 1965, the United States had a soft policy of quietly accepting selective proliferation amongst allies. And this is why we got the UK and France got nuclear weapons. We haven't had that position in about 50, 60 years. We've by and large said, which I think is correctly, that expanded proliferation is not in American interest, and that's in part why we did nuclear burden sharing in Europe, and that's in part why we placed nuclear weapons in Korea during the Cold War and elsewhere, and had theater nuclear systems. Before we got to the point of South Korea becoming an independent nuclear power, I would like to see the United States make an attempt to reinvigorate our nuclear posture in the Western Pacific, to include things like the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile. I'm very open to putting nuclear munitions in Korea again. I'm also quite open to having Korean pilots on Korean aircraft fly American nuclear weapons as part of an integrated deterrence posture. I'm open to that before you get to Korea having an independent arsenal. But at the end of the day, the goal is stability and deterring war. And so if the last best option before you got to, a war or stability breaking down is Korea unfortunately becoming an independent nuclear power, I think that should be at least a legitimate conversation. It shouldn't be ground ruled out. You may disagree, Bridge.
I think the logic that Bob put out is exactly right. Nuclear proliferation, even to our allies, is a bad thing, but we live in a world of hard choices, so I think everything needs to be on the table. I don't personally advocate for nuclear proliferation, but I think we need to be open together. The most important thing is our geopolitical interests and our alignment, and in this context, the security of South Korea, and a credible, real plan. The one thing I'll say about nuclear sharing and theater forces is I'm also sort of supportive in principle, but the problem is that it still doesn't grapple with the issue that those are ultimately under the control of the United States and the U.S. president, and so North Korea will know where the ultimate return address is. That could be an area where you could soften that. They might ostensibly still be American forces, but essentially be pre-delegated in a kind of way, look, let's be honest. The Chinese, they ignore the ICJ ruling. The North Koreans have blown through any number of nuclear negotiations. Maybe we can, my favorite example of this is the Chinese volunteers in the Korean War. Maybe we can use some convenient fictions ourselves sometimes.
I want both your opinions on this. As you laid out, South Koreans are aware that United States' priority is non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. But many of them think that maybe President Trump would be different, that he would not think conventionally, and that he may even think that South Korea getting its own nuclear weapons may contribute to the security of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And he did hint it at this with previous comments before, years ago. What is your take?
Well, I certainly wouldn't presume to speak for President Trump, and I don't, or his campaign, but I would say, as Bob rightly put, American priority has been on nuclear nonproliferation, and it has been a reasonable and valid and I think appropriate course for many years. However, the strategic situation that has emerged and our lack of military readiness and the buildup of China and North Korea, et cetera, presents us with a much different situation that the old religion, if you will, is not suited to. And when we talk about the 5 cities and so forth, obviously a common sense proposal and the kind of real alternative that Bob is proposing suggests to us that has dubious credibility, right? And so what President Trump, I think, has absolutely rightly been calling for, and the political movement that's behind him, and I think it appeals across a significant spectrum of American political views, is putting American interests first. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean isolation, but it means, look, what's in our interest? And is it in our interest to sanction our ally or prevent our ally from taking measures that are going to make it more secure when we are not in the mood to double defense spending and we are in a war-weary mood? These are the kind of situation we're in, a kind of post-Vietnam situation. In that context, I think we need to be more accommodating of serious moves by our allies to take more responsibility for their own security. But that's only going to be reasonable and tenable if we're being willing to be flexible. And I say that at the same time that I'd say nuclear nonproliferation is a good thing. Let's try to find a way other than friendly nuclear proliferation. By the way, friendly nuclear proliferation does not solve all our problems. However, it's got to be serious and it's got to be immediate, because the threat of a war with China, and by the way, a potential war with North Korea, is in this decade, or maybe even sooner.
Well, we'll continue our discussion next time. Mr. Peters, Mr. Colby, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the 2 Koreas and the region right here from Washington.